Have you ever thought, is this just me when struggling to stay organized, start tasks, or manage time? For those of us over 50, these challenges might not be just aging. They could be ADHD hiding in plain sight for decades. I'm Jami Shapiro, host of Grandma Has ADHD, and I'm building a community where your experiences matter. Whether you're diagnosed, questioning, or simply curious, you're not alone. Our Facebook group is filled with vibrant, understanding people over 50 who share their stories, strategies, and yes, even their struggles, with plenty of laughter along the way. Ready to find your people? Join our growing Grandma Has ADHD Facebook community. Please like and subscribe to the podcast wherever you listen and share it with someone who might need to hear they're not alone, because ADHD doesn't have an age limit and neither does understanding yourself better. Together, we're changing the conversation about ADHD after 50. Come be part of the story. Hi, and welcome to today's episode of Grandma Has ADHD. I am joined by a very special guest, Jeff Copper, who I actually had the opportunity to hear speak as a thought leader at the International ADHD Conference. And I went up to him after I heard him speak, and he was so gracious and really wanting to bring Grandma Has ADHD to center stage among the ADHD community. I will tell you that he's quite impressive, which I learned when I heard him speak. And again, a thought leader in a pretty amazing community of people. He has an MBA behind his name, as well as some very other I'm losing, when you lose the words and the initials. So, and he's nodding his head because just before the interview, we had to switch. We had to go from my StreamYard, which is normally where I record, to Zoom. And I had to share with him that I am sitting in my 16-year-old daughter's room because that's where I get the best internet connection. And I had to mask her messy room. And I said, but that ADHD community, they kind of get it. So it's a very forgiving space. And I hope you will forgive me for not remembering all of the letters, because you earned those letters. They were, they took you time and effort, and I don't want to diminish them. But Jeff Copper, thank you so much. I also want to share that Jeff also hosts his own ADHD radio show. So I'm a little more intimidated than I might normally be because he really knows what he's doing. But welcome to Grandma Has ADHD.
Jami, thank you for having me on, and thank God it's taken somebody so long to do something like this, because Grandma has ADHD, and most grandmas don't know, and there's not a lot of resources out there. So thank you on behalf of the ADHD community for what you're doing. This is I'm glad to see somebody's in this space.
I appreciate that acknowledgement. And, one of the things that I've learned with ADHD is that we tend to focus on where we are, because we have the two times, the now and not now. And most of us are not forward thinking about what's going to come next. And as I have shared in the podcast, this isn't just for grandma. It's also for grandpa and for seniors who may not have grandchildren. But I've been told it's a really catchy name. Yep. And it's more likely, and you probably agree with me, that women are going to be underdiagnosed more than men, just typically because, not that we all follow gender conformity, but typically men were the ADHD boys in school who might have been diagnosed, where girls were inattentive and we didn't think girls had ADHD. So you have a whole generation of women, especially, who were completely not even misdiagnosed, not diagnosed, or maybe diagnosed with anxiety, depression, or some other condition that really was ADHD.
Absolutely. Well, I always tell people, there's plumbing differences and hormonal difference. So why would ADHD present the same way in women and men? And back in the DSM-4 days, they had 3 different kinds, and women tend to internalize things a little bit more. So they're more commonly diagnosed with depression and stuff early on. There's also some buddy research they've changed the name on something called sluggish cognitive tempo that was often misunderstood with regard to inattentive. So as a general rule, particularly for the grandmas back in the time, it was common for them to not get diagnosed properly. Hopefully they're getting the right diagnosis and can do some stuff with their life. So hopefully we can talk about some of that.
Good. Well, I am excited to have you. So, share a little bit about your background, your ADHD journey, and how you got into the ADHD space.
So I was diagnosed with dyslexia at age 9 early on. There was a hint in the report that I might have ADHD, but for the majority of my life, dyslexia and learning disability was the impairment that I was aware of and dealt with the most. It wasn't until much later in life that I got diagnosed with ADHD. I had already been doing some things. Quite honestly, I had figured out by that time that I didn't do everything like everybody else does. So I really was unique in as much I didn't really care how everybody else did it. So I had really kind of figured out my own quirky things to do. So
Mhm.
by the time I got the diagnosis, it's there. Dyslexia is probably a bigger challenge of mine, but the ADD doesn't, it's not very, I mean, it certainly muddies up the water a little bit, but I didn't get the diagnosis until my late 30s. And
Okay.
it explained a lot and was helpful, but I had kind of departed conventional wisdom early on and just started to innovate stuff on my own. And I really didn't have the difficulty many people do with realizing they do things differently and accepting it
Okay. So, did you get your MBA before knowing that you had ADHD?
during it.
Oh, interesting. Okay. So, you
Yeah.
went, would you say now that getting your MBA later in life, although I don't consider 30s old, but for, going back to school might be, do you think that the ADHD played into when you went back?
Um, it didn't necessarily. I run that troop all the time. There was a bunch of events that kind of came together where I stumbled into it and got the diagnosis.
Hmm.
Once I did, it was helpful. What was interesting to me was later in life, I read the book called Dyslexic Advantage, and to my surprise, when you have dyslexia, and this isn't for everybody, but the higher you go in education, the better you do. So when I was in elementary school, I didn't even take college prep. Like I couldn't handle English, much less Spanish, and I didn't take any chemistry. I was fortunate enough to go to college only on a swimming scholarship,
Oh,
which provided some interesting things. I had unlimited tutors. And so my sophomore year, first semester at Indiana, I think they had 35,000 students. I think I had the highest tutoring bill on campus. It was like,
wow.
hey, if I can get some help, why do this the hard way? And that's always been kind of, I'm not going to say I'm looking for the shortcut, but I'm always been looking forward to be as efficient as I could. And so I got through college, and then later in life, I went and got my MBA. And the further higher I went educational wise, the better I did, which was a bit of surprise, which is also, the higher you go in education, the less right answers there are.
Mm.
So it was unique for me in that experience. But the key with me is I had so much difficulty with dyslexia as a kid. I literally had to abandon whatever you were supposed to do and kind of fend for myself. And I was able to figure a lot of that out.
Well, which is an amazing trait of ADHD. We're problem solvers. So, of course, you would innovate and figure
Yep.
out, right? So, what would you say were good coping strategies? Because you said that the ADHD didn't impact you as much, but
So, so like I remember, whenever reading's difficult to me because of my dyslexia, like if I'm looking at a B, I'll retrieve a D. So when you read a sentence, it might say boy, but I'll read doy. And then I got to go back and cognitively recipher all that stuff, which is kind of frustrating for me. And I
Mhm.
got into college, and of course, they're like, give him stuff that he likes, that he's interested in. That's the go-to type thing. But nobody really understood the cognitive effort it took for me. So my first semester in college, I was taking sociology of sport. Basically, they were teaching us sociology through the game of soccer.
Ah,
And the reading was massive. I can remember the first like 10 days I'm in there, I'm just sobbing in tears because I can't keep up with it. So I started to like, I'll just read the first sentence of each paragraph. Well, I'm exaggerating, but social books are nothing but run-on sentences. So then I just got to where I read the first line of each paragraph, and I began to listen to the gist of what they were trying to say. And I would go to class and I would take notes, detailed notes, and I was able to, get an A minus in the class, which is okay. And
wow.
so doing that was a way that I learned, just like I said, listen to the gist of what people say and not hang on their every word, which has actually been very helpful for me later in life. The other thing is that I had to write a term paper in that class. And the thought of having to write 15 pages by going do the research in the library drove me crazy. But I realized that if I interviewed people, that I could actually interview them and use their quotes as footnotes. And that's what I did, which fast forward when I got into the ADHD coaching and I needed to get out there back in 2008, everybody said, you got to write a blog or you got to write a book because you got to make a name for yourself. And I'm like, I can't, no, I don't want to write. I can't do that. So I actually started my podcast. As a direct result of that. And it was fascinating because it was unintended, but by doing the podcast, I could talk to people. I didn't have to write. And little did I know I would get an education that you can't get in a book because I was interviewing all the experts and I was learning. I got to ask the questions. Right. And it has really paid off for me. And those are just two things that I've learned to do over the years that were really kind of my way of doing it that really, really helped. And part of this, I'm sharing my experience, but what I'd like people to take is that if you have ADHD, don't stick to convention. A lot of times, listen to your gut. Pay attention to your instincts. Though, if you listen to them, they'll help guide you to what works.
Mm-hmm. I think it's really important that we get rid of the shame. Like we first really have to separate the shame around. And I, say frequently in these interviews, none of us chose ADHD. I guess it chose us. And you were probably at the keynote when Penn Holderness talked about the button, and he said that if he, could turn that button, click that button and turn off his ADHD. And I'm finding this to be the case among most of the guests that I've had. Most of us, at earlier points in our lives might have hit that off button, but most of us are actually really grateful for the ADHD and the resilience and the innovation. And to your point, every time I interview somebody new, I am just more tools in my toolbox. So having said that, you are an ADHD coach. How did you go from MBA to ADHD coach?
That's a really, really kind of complicated story. Let me just say that I got out of college, I got a job selling group insurance and pension investments with Aetna. I did that for a period of time, and I was really an athlete most of my life. I came down to Florida, I was working for a company, and as a sales guy, I learned to underwrite, and I was able to go in and price things out, which is blah, 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 blah. But once I could do that, I got successful business-wise. And I was like, wow, this is kind of amazing. I never dreamed that I could be good at something like this. And so my competitive juices moved from more swimming and triathlons into work. And I found an interest in finance. And so that's what propelled me to go back to get my degree in finance with my MBA with a concentration in finance, which was fascinating to me because I struggled as a kid. But by the time I got to my MBA in my late 30s, the first class I took, I didn't take a test because I didn't really want to. And that was the difference for me having a 4.0 that I regret. But I never expected that I was going to do that well. So fast forward, I'd gotten in the upstart world for a while, and my life was at a time where my ex at the time was over 40, female, a large organization with a stable salary. So we decided that I would be more of an entrepreneur and stay home with the kids for a while. So I was Mr. Mom for about 9 months. And coaching was a means for me to kind of start a business and kind of grow with it. And instantaneously, I talked to a friend who knew me that suggested that I work with people with ADHD because I was very organized at the time, at least they thought. And so I really found a home in the ADHD community very quickly because the creativity that I began to use to solve my own problems really lended itself to that. And most people think that I'm going to tell them what to do in terms of behavioral training. I really don't. My job is incredibly creative. I mean, Ned Hollowell was interviewing me when they released the book 2.0, which was a rewrite of Driven to Distraction. And I was on the show, and I had this conversation. I know it was kind of fun because I caught Ned off guard because I was explaining that I coached a woman one time where a smell-based to-do list worked. And he's like, what? Like, oh no, if you get the right crayons, they have an odor to it. And he didn't know what's going on. Never before, never since have I ever done that with somebody. But the creativity that is involved with really trying to help somebody understand how their brain works and what it's attracted to is really, really kind of what I do. So I have my little aha Bob guy here, which is an insight. And so again, my job is incredibly insightful. And, I really don't go to work. I go to fun every day.
Oh, I love that. I don't go to work, I go to fun. Okay, awesome. I'm going to pause for just a second and listen to our sponsors, but get rid of this frog in my throat. Ever wondered why helping a loved one declutter feels like speaking different languages? I did, especially with my mom. It wasn't until I founded Silver Linings Transitions, helping San Diego seniors organize, and move for over a decade that I discovered why. We all experience clutter differently. And for those of us with ADHD, it's a whole other world. If you are listening in the San Diego area and feeling stuck with moving, paperwork, photos, or home organization, our team at Silver Linings Transitions gets it. We understand ADHD's unique challenges, and we won't just help you get organized. We'll create sustainable systems that finally stick. Schedule a consultation with our team today at 760-522-1624. That's 760-522-1624, or find us at silverliningstransitions.com. Okay, we are back with Jeff Copper sharing. I love his idea, Bob. I'm going to do a squirrel moment for you for a second and tell you my stepfather who raised me was Bob. And so whenever I hear Bob, I always think of him. How did you come up with Bob?
I don't really know. What's funny is when I first started coaching, I was really having some difficulty with marketing my stuff. And I went to a bunch of experts and there was like, Jeff, you don't get it. And I'm like, no, you don't get it. But anyway, fast forward that I finally was dealing with a woman that was a part-time writer, and she was saying, your problem marketing wise, Jeff, is you're trying to change people's conceptual understanding of something before they even get what you're talking about. Like the world thinks, people think the world's flat and you know it to be round. It's like, you got to convince them that it's round before they understand. He said, you can't do that in 6 seconds or 8 words. I'm like, oh my God, which is right. And so I was like, at that moment, I began to understand some things. So anyway, Aha Bob is what we call him, became the symbol of that. And if you really look closely at the light bulb, Aha is spelt into his brain, which a lot of people don't necessarily get. And so I don't really know why it came about, but my graphics person and I, we just started referring to it as Aha Bob, and it has stuck ever since.
I love it. I remember Aha Bob.
Yep. So Aha Bob is one of those things. I'm a little bit different coach because I interviewed Dr. Russell Barkley for years and began to study his construct that refers to ADHD as an executive function impairment, which is absolutely brilliant. The model is phenomenal. And so my practice, I spend most of the time, we make observations off of what we can see. Executive functions are intangible, so we have a tendency to treat the symptoms. And ADHD is really more of a thinking impairment than most people realize.
So give me some examples so that people can understand what you mean by that.
Sure. Let's do an attention exercise.
Okay.
You remember exponents when you were in school?
You might need to tell me what those are. Math was not mine.
Like 2 to the power of 3, go
Yes.
2 times 2
Yes.
times 2 would be 8,
Mm-hmm.
okay?
Okay.
Without using your fingers
Okay.
and without talking out loud, can you calculate for me the 3 to the power of 5?
Uh-huh. Yes. Oh, you mean tell you what it is? 15?
Calculate. No, it's 3 times 3 times 3 times 3.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, that's what you told me. Now I'm really showing it's not my ADHD, it's my poor math. So, without using my fingers? Oh, without using my fingers, you just stumped me. So
Okay. So the reason I do this is that to do this, you have to go 3 times 3 is 9 times 3 is 27 times 3.
Uh-huh.
So you're having to keep track of the calculations inside your head, but you also have to keep track of the number of times you've
right. That's why I
multiplied it
can't
times
put out my
3.
finger. Right.
That's why I said not do your fingers.
Mm-mm.
And so what you're having to do is you're having to hold this in your mind as you do these calculations, right? Well, ADHD is an executive functioning impairment. You're using your working memory to get to that answer. It's impaired. It's harder for you to do that than a neurotypical.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what was fun was for the viewers and or listeners out there, you could hear in her voice, you had an emotional reaction when I tasked you with it. Emotional regulation is an executive function. When I'm tasking you with something that's cognitively difficult, you were like, oh, you had an emotional reaction to the exercise I was going to put you in, because I was putting you in exercise that was going to be cognitively difficult for you, and your reflective action was to escape it.
Interesting. Yes. And if you would let me write it down, I could have done it, by the way. Which
is the trick. people with ADHD say they're big problem solvers. Well, I'm not saying they're not, but ADHD is an executive function impairment. Executive functions are a collection of mind tools that we use to solve problems. The issue really is people with ADHD, because it's impaired, they struggle to do it inside their head. If they can externalize the thinking, then they can do it. If they can't, they can't. So the exercise of 3 to the power 5, I mean, some neurotypicals can get it, some struggle with it, but the intention was to say, that's thinking inside your head towards the goal. Now, I'm not talking about contemplating. I'm not talking about learning. I'm not talking about judging. I'm not talking about daydreaming. I'm not talking about worrying. People you use thoughts for all those things and they get confused. Problem solving is actually solving a problem. And I'll tell you right now, Jami, you don't have to show me your procrastination list, but I could probably guarantee about 80% of the items that you're putting off have 2 characteristics. They're multifaceted and they're ambiguous.
Okay.
Because they're ambiguous, removing ambiguity requires you to think. So reflexively, you escape to do something that's cognitively easier.
Do you know what I've discovered my escape is? I like to clean. So when there's something that I don't want to do or there's a big project, I find myself cleaning.
So when I'm working with people, the aha really is, it's a focus problem, but it's more of a problem solving impairment. And I'm a big proponent of behavioral training doesn't really work very well. You can train people's behavior, it's changeable, but impairments have an impact on behavior. Impairments require accommodations. Like my eyesight is impaired. There's no amount of behavioral training that's going to enable me to read. If I have the accommodation, then I can read. So my aha Bob here is really about the aha is it's a focus problem, but we need to accommodate it as a thinking impairment, really more of a problem solving impairment if we're going to have lasting change. And that's very different from what conventional wisdom would have you do. But I can sit there and tell people, like, quite frankly, have you ever noticed the correlation between uncertainty and avoidance? It's huge.
Yes.
There's also a correlation between clarity and motivation. As long as it's not boring.
Right.
You have clarity, you typically do it. So people are like, oh my God, I got to get momentum. Well, that's a feeling that you get when you're doing some stuff. When you're doing some stuff, that happens when you're clear. So when I'm coaching people, don't focus so much on the momentum, focus on getting the clarity, because that's the root cause of what you're trying to do. So at the end of the day is a lot of what I'm doing really is trying to help people to look at ADHD a little bit differently and help them problem solve, which is one of the things. Go ahead.
No, go ahead. No, I was going to say, I want to make sure that we turn that into how this is going to translate to older adults. And
that's exactly where I was going right there. So
nice.
When you hit age 4, like the exercise of 3 to the power 5, I was asking you to use your working memory to do that calculation. Well, when you start to hit age 40, I don't care who you are, but your working memory begins to deteriorate. So if you've got ADHD and you've got an impaired working memory and age begins to deteriorate, it begins to get worse over a period of time. Now, part of the challenge in our world right now, and you and I talked about this before we're kind of coming together, is that a lot of the world is going digital and it requires you to toggle. Now, this is a really complicated concept I'm going to try to make simple, and that is, if I were to give you a website and send you like a PDF of a password and said, you can't print the PDF off, you have to toggle between the website and the PDF, and you have to read the password and you have to hold it in your working memory to put it into the website to get through it, and I gave you a complicated password, you'd get so frustrated you probably wouldn't do it. My point really is that when you have ADHD, the fact that you're having to grab information from one place, have some instructions between getting that to where you need to go while holding that information in mind and plugging it in is a challenge. As you get older, it deteriorates. Particularly now, more and more older people are having to toggle among things. There's less access to paper. And so one of the things that I'm a big advocate of what you're doing is heightening this to realize it's there, or even as something as simple as, have you noticed, like my mom is 81 years old and I dread every time Apple releases a new iOS, because it changes the look and the feel. And my mom has to relearn that stuff. She doesn't have ADHD, but it's cognitively more difficult. So if
Sure.
you've got ADHD and you're in your 60s and 70s and you're having to toggle and the world is constantly changing, it's just a burden that's weighing. And that's why I'm a big fan of you, and I hooked you up with Wilma Feldman because she was starting this years ago. We need more and more people to speak out. Now,
Right.
I believe is it Tim Cook, whoever the CEO of Apple is. Recently, I found out that there's a new iOS that's pared down. It's very simple for older people.
Oh,
I
that's
haven't had a
great.
chance to experience it, but the fact that you're doing this to advocate, because if you have ADHD and you're older, it's taking this impairment, age is making it worse, and technology is making it 1,000 times worse. And they're trying to shame you into, well, why can't you use this technology? Well, it doesn't work like that. As you get older, the ability to learn deteriorates, your cognitive ability does, and all of a sudden you just feel like you're the one that's not getting it, when in reality, there's neurotypicals that are suffering with this too. But again, that's why your work is so important to get the word out.
Well, and I want to throw one more thing that you didn't mention, and that's the stigma that exists for especially that generation. And
Yes.
I don't know. I know you have younger kids, younger than you are. Obviously, my kids are 23, 21, and 16. And, they have an issue and they're all over the internet sharing, oh, this is my anxiety. This is whatever it is. But, the boomers and definitely the silent generation and then, the greatest generation, if they had a problem, they didn't go to therapy. They didn't address it. So, yes, I'm dealing with all of the things that come with aging, the awareness of ADHD, and then also I don't know that I want to share that I have this or go and get those accommodations that I need. But
Yep.
to your point, my life would be so much better if I could put these glasses on. My youngest was just actually diagnosed at 16. I didn't see it because it looks very different on all of my children. 2 of my 3 have it. And she is, she's getting accommodations in school, which if I had had those, or even more, my mom, who was the original grandma, she said if she didn't complete college, and my mom is super bright, and she said if she had known she had ADHD, and if she, could have medicated or been aware, her life would have been
Yep.
completely different. So
Absolutely.
part of my mission is awareness, because, there's no reason we can't. And my tagline is make the rest of your life the best of your life. Once you can improve, but we have to talk about it. And then we have to also, soothe that wound of what would my life have been like if I had known.
Yep.
And so there's a lot at play, but I am an advocate. I mean, someone with ADHD, once they have a cause, until they lose interest in that cause.
Yep. But you have so much material. You have no idea. Like there's so many times, like, let's talk about the older generation. It's been stigmatized that ADHD is not a thing, and medications have been demonized, and everybody talks about these negative long-term impacts. I'm not going to say there's not an impact potentially, but also the long-term impact of you're twice as likely to get divorced, you're twice as likely to become disabled, higher divorce rates, lower performance in school, lower performance in work. I mean, it goes on and on and on. So there's the long-term implications of not taking the medications. And so often, the older crowd, the press has demonized the medications, which I'll get to in a second. And so many times people don't seek that out until a moment of last resort. Well, the shame and the wheels have come off. It shouldn't be the last choice. And so now there's this stigma and there's this, everybody's afraid of what's going on because of this stuff. And by the way, the media socializes it. Stimulant medications are an abused substance. Athletes use them as performance-enhancing drugs. So if Chris Brown and the Braves or Wes Walker takes it, they're quick to say, oh my God, these are an ADHD drug. Well, no, they're a performance-enhancing drug that's being used by an athlete like other types of things. It doesn't have anything to do with ADHD, but they demonize it as if it's an ADHD problem. And so there's a lot of misinformation. And you getting out there to give the educations to open people's mind. What I'm saying, I'm not pro-med, but I'm anti-suffering. And there's a lot of people whose life could really benefit from something like this. And they don't have the education to realize that there's a long-term impact of not doing this. You know what I'm saying?
Well, Absolutely. But, the challenge that's going to come with the seniors is going to be how it mixes and interacts with other medications and other health conditions. So while I am very pro medication when it's appropriate, I am absolutely doing this podcast to pills don't teach skills because
Yes.
it's right. So I've really tried to stay very neutral when it comes to medication, not because I am against it, but because I'm really aware of.
Yeah. But what my point is, as you're educating seniors on what it is and what it's not, so they can make an informed decision for themselves, not being swayed by emotions of the public and what's going on. And pills don't teach the skills. And so a lot of times, like I know this is that it frustrates me because in my podcast, I've had people want to advertise in my program with an app that they claim is ADHD friendly. And if you really understand ADHD, it's like, okay, this app, it's visual, but if you understand working memory, the fact that they're delivering it to you on a cell phone that requires you to toggling is rendering the concept useless. In other words, the very device that they're delivering in makes it worse. And people don't understand that, but you're programmed to think, oh my God, this is a be all end all when it's not. And so that's why what you're doing is so important, to get the word out for people to be aware of it and be conscious of what's going on. Because there's a lot of stuff out there that it sounds really good, but it doesn't necessarily work. And again, seniors are the ones that probably need it the most, which is why I'm like, thank God you started this, because it's been needed for a long time.
Well, I appreciate it. So having said that, and I love the pats on the back there, especially, with that.
I'm not kidding. I'm serious. I'm serious with a heart attack. Like nobody's ever talked about this crowd, and Grandma Has ADHD is brilliant. When I met you, I introduced you to a whole bunch of people, like game on, you need to do this.
Thank you. I appreciate it. So having said that, to our audience who is listening to this, and, like I said, I feel like I am slowly building a bridge, one pebble at a time, right? What can you say to improve the quality of life for a senior or a family member who is frustrated by is like, listen, I know my mom or dad has this, and I know I've got some of those interviews coming. How do I approach the subject with them? How do I, get them to understand where, even bringing in a coach, especially if medication is not an option? And why does it matter? That's one of my biggest frustrations is when people say. So
I'm going to try not to talk too fast. This is a big topic. To really understand it, Jami, can you imagine what it would be like to stand in front of all your family, all your friends, all your business associates, and just take all your clothes off and stand in front of them butt naked?
Could I do it 7 years ago when I liked my body?
Can you imagine what it'd be like right now to do that?
No, I'm kidding. It was a joke. Like I was. Yeah, right. So you feel like that's.
No, hang on. Can you feel the anxiety in your body? So executive functions, one of them is emotional regulation. When you are threatened with your life, I always define an emotion as a reflexive reaction. So if you're threatened with your life, you go to fight, flight, or freeze. It's a reflex. It's not a choice. You're not thinking it. It's a reflex. I asked a woman one time about the naked thing. I said, why wouldn't you want to take your clothes off? She said, I wouldn't want to reveal my mommy tummy. In other words, I'm revealing things that I don't want people to see. This is important because self-awareness is an executive function. It's an executive function. To be self-aware means you need to look at yourself in the mirror, metaphorically butt naked. It's not a comfortable experience. In fact, there's a lot of people that are not self-aware because there's lots of things about themselves that they really don't want to admit. So reflexively, people with ADHD are defensive when you're approaching them. So that's why this is such a hard conversation, is if you're going to them, and it doesn't matter what you're doing, it's their interpretation. If they feel criticized or threatened, again, I said this is a reflex. Reflexively, they're fighting back. You're coming in peace with all the love in the world, but it doesn't feel like it to them, and they're not even aware of it. So reflexively, they're fighting back. So the trick of this is, how do you create a safe enough environment? Because if you're a therapist, if you're a coach, if you're anybody, you've got to create that safe environment for people to take their defenses down in order to begin to do this. And oftentimes loved ones see somebody in pain and they don't want the pain and they're trying really, really hard. They don't realize I got to get them to do it as a very controlling mindset. And the more you're trying to get somebody with ADHD to do something about it, the more defensive they are. So it's really a delicate balance to kind of come in and be empathetic to get their guard down, because you want to control, you want influence in what they're doing, not to try to control them. And it's a delicate balance because, again, this is an executive function. It's a reflexive reaction. A lot of people with ADHD, they don't necessarily want to have it. So how do you get somebody's attention that they need help when reflexively they're feeling threatened and they're going to fight, flight, or freeze? I mean, I can't solve the problem in this.
Oh, I was waiting for you to tell me.
But the issue is, that's why this is so delicate. And the one thing I will tell you is that if you go after them too hard, you're going to make it worse.
Right.
Because and that's counterintuitive, because you have to self-regulate yourself. You have to pause and calm yourself down, which is like an ADHD thing, not to go do that. You love them. You don't want to have trouble, but it's really hard. I'm a big fan of Elaine Taylor-Klaus at Impact Parents, and she talks about this a lot, is when you have kids, if you're trying to control them, you want influence on them. The more you try to get them to get it, the more influence you leave. So it's kind of counterintuitive, but it's not an easy answer. And if you had the answer to this, Jami, you wouldn't be here. I tell you that you'd be Nobel Peace Prize. You'd be a billionaire, because it's tricky.
Well, I will share one of the things that I do in my real job as a senior move manager and a senior home consultant is, a lot of times we go into a situation where an adult parent is, really not doing as well, and there's a decline, and you can see it in their activities of daily living. And so what I remind the adult child, that this is your parent. They still want to be your parent. They want to we don't want to be strict of that role, right? I said, sometimes you have to come from it as, the choices that you are making are impacting my mental health because I worry about you. And so this is why taking steps to help with your memory, like a perfect example for me, I left boiling eggs on my stovetop. I was in my 40s, maybe early 50s. Nobody wants to say, oh, she's got dementia, let's put her in a, senior community. But when it happens to a senior, then we all want to go to that. So I don't want to worry about you. I think that, and my mom actually and I have bonded over the ADHD. And I've said we are closer now than we've ever been, because I finally understand my mom in a way that I used to think she was just like, why can't you just get it together? And now I realize there's a reason.
So I want to validate, remember, you're doing this not by attacking them. You're saying, hey, I'm worried, type of a thing. The thing about people that are with ADHD that are older, like my mom is 82. I just came back from her yesterday for Christmas, and we've talked to her like, Mom, I need you to get in an independent living facility because it's more of a dorm environment. It's more social. Like, I'll worry less of you. But what I said a second ago is, if you're pushing to get them to get it, you're going to have a hard time. What you're doing is great. Hey, I'm worried about this. It keeps me up at night. And you're not forcing them, that you're putting them in choice, and you're taking the guard down. So yeah, I 100% agree with that kind of mindset to approach it. 100%.
Right. And I want to educate you. We call it the F word, facility. It's a community. And it's a facility if it's skilled nursing or memory care, but independent or assisted living is not a facility. So that's what
I'm not living in that world vernacular, but words are important. Right. So that's, I thank you for bringing that up. That's a good point.
Absolutely. Well, I'll even have a senior client say to me, I'm moving to a facility, and I'll say, do you belong in a facility? So this is where my worlds are intersecting. I've been working with seniors for more than 10 years, and then discovered the ADHD, and then I put the two together as.
So I said this a couple of times before, just correcting me on that is what we need. That's why I'm a big fan of what you're doing. It sounds subtle, but it's really important because it has a lot to do with mindset, which is why we need more of that. I don't deal in this space very much, but Jami, what you're doing is really needed, and you're doing a great job.
I really appreciate it. And I really appreciate you having me. First of all, how can anybody who's listening and wants to work with you, give me a little bit about your coaching practice, and then we'll give them, how they can find you.
Well, if you go to Dig Coaching Practice, digcoaching.com, that's my website. You can access my podcast, my YouTube channel, everything that's there. I do one-on-one coaching. I have engineered a new field of engineering called cognitive ergonomics from the inside out. Systems engineering is a field of engineering about processes. Ergonomics is about fitting the job to the user. It's quite advanced in the physical world, not so advanced in the cognitive world. What I've done is I've used Dr. Barkley's model, something I've developed called attention scope, and it's not coaching, it's not therapy, it's an engineering approach to designing accommodations to fit the cognitive abilities of the person. It's really good for therapists, teachers, disability specialists, etc. It is really good for people with ADHD, unless if you have dealt with a lot of shame in your life, it's a bad class to take. It can actually create some harm, but it's a very black and white approach. And my hope is that it will become the catalyst for Americans with Disabilities Act to incorporate accommodations, which are hidden in plain sight, but nobody's ever been to find them at the level to legitimize them. And so it's something I'm excited about. But again, all that's a lot of blah, 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 blah. At the end of the day, digcoaching.com is my website, and you get lost on the website. There's so much information. But anyway, we do what we do to help you.
I really appreciated your enthusiasm when we met at conference, and then your willingness to introduce me to the people. I really want Dr. Ned Hallowell on he's the first person that I started listening to when I discovered my own ADHD. So he is he's my gold star at the top of the tree that I am trying to win over. But there are just so many amazing people in this space. And that's one of my favorite things about doing this podcast now is, I'm trying to, in trying to reduce the stigma around ADHD, is like, we are incredibly bright, funny people that, in fact, when I ask someone if I think, when I ask if they think they may have ADHD, I always tell them it's a compliment. Like, really, it's a compliment. So thank you so much for taking to be on my podcast.
Appreciate it.
All right. Thanks so much to everybody who listened. We're going to have information for finding Jeff Copper of Dig Coaching Practice in the show notes. And thanks for joining. The opinions expressed on Grandma Has ADHD podcast are those of our guests and hosts and are intended for informational and entertainment purposes only. This podcast does not provide medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. The content discussed in this episode is not a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always seek the advice of your physician, mental health professional, or other qualified health provider with any questions you may have regarding a medical condition or mental health concern. Never disregard professional medical advice or delay in seeking it because of something you have heard on this podcast. If you think you may have a medical emergency, call your doctor or emergency services immediately. The host, guests, and producers of Grandma Has ADHD do not assume any liability for the content of this podcast. Listen at your own discretion.